Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of Open Source in Business, a series of conversations that we'll be having with a wide lens on the role of open source in the industry. I'm Dave Neary, and I started this thinking about this topic with some friends this summer. We were having yet another conversation on social media about how companies can be successful with open source. And so over the coming weeks, we'll be bringing experts together for live interactive discussions of a variety of topics. Our first episode, available on demand and on YouTube, featured Adam Jacob and Scott McCarthy discussing product management and open source with a focus on thinking about open source projects as part of a supply chain. Other topics in upcoming episodes will include the labor economics of open source, the interaction between open source and standards adoption, the economics of open source service companies, and the role that nonprofits play in enabling collaboration enabling corporate collaboration. So we're going to cover a broad range of topics, hopefully bringing a wider view to the role that open source plays in the industry in general, than simply focusing on how a company started around an open source project can become successful and have a successful exit. Although we will talk about that as well. So this week, I'm joined by Stephen O'Grady, principal analyst and co-founder of Redmonk, an analyst firm that's taken a different approach to industry analysis by focusing on grassroots adoption of technology as a leading indicator of market trends. We're going to discuss the role that convenience has played in open source adoption historically, and how on-demand consumption of cloud services has affected that dynamic in the last decade. Thank you for joining me, Stephen.
My pleasure.
So I saw you deliver a presentation on this topic exactly a year ago at Monktoberfest, your annual event. Could you elaborate a little on the core thesis of the relationship between convenience and software adoption?
Sure. So the basic premise is that we sort of underplay the role of convenience, sort of in this industry, right? So on a sort of personal level, right, all of us have sort of some knowledge of, some appreciation for convenience in our day-to-day lives, right? So the presentation you're referring to looks at the history as an example of 7-Eleven and how 7-Eleven ended up essentially being open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and so on. And it largely came down to what you would expect from a convenience store, right? Which is convenient to go. I can go anytime I want. I don't have to sort of, care what hour it is or day and so on. Or, look, I want, sort of a bunch of basic items in one place. So that's a sort of premise, again, that sort of all of us know, but from a technology industry standpoint, we don't appreciate it, perhaps the way that we should. And, this is sort of evidenced by the fact that, I've had countless conversations with vendors, large, small, everything in between. And I've asked them the question of, how many times have you had a meeting, sort of any kind of planning session specifically around convenience? I have yet to have anybody ever say that they've had that, right? That has been explicitly a number one sort of the topic of discussion, which is interesting because, bringing it back to open source, really to me, what has made open source so valuable for so many is the fact that it was more convenient, right? And this is across a number of dimensions, in the sense of I could, sort of as a developer, I could go get it. I didn't have to talk to anybody about a license. I could just download it and go. It might be, hey, I want to learn more about how this works, or hey, I found something that isn't working. I don't have to go through necessarily the same channels, to get fixes, sort of patches, sort of approved and contributed back. So anyhow, it is just that much more convenient, than the proprietary software that largely preceded it within the enterprise. But sort of the sort of one of the things that when I have this conversation with open source, folks in particular, they tend to say, "Oh yeah, that's right. Hey, that's that's fantastic," and isn't that sort of great for for us moving forward. But one of the things that a lot of the open source projects that I talk to fail to appreciate, or at least internalize, is the degree to which the managed service, the cloud sort of managed services, are that much more convenient, right? So in other words, let's just take as an example the case of a database, right? if you go back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it's obviously much more convenient to just download a sort of database like MySQL or Postgres than it would be to try to go find a license, for some proprietary alternative, right? So open source is that much more convenient. These days, however, what's more convenient than just downloading sort of a sort of version of a database and sort of getting it up and running and so on? It's not doing any of that, right? I don't have to find hardware. I don't have to find space in it, and I also, in many cases, don't have to talk about a license, right? I can basically just go to sort of any one of these managed cloud service providers and say, hey, I basically I have some project that I want to build. It needs a database, and I can get that instantiated essentially at no cost to me in 90 seconds, right? So convenience, therefore, is something that is at least in my view personally a critical factor to adoption, and yet something that open source has been successful with, but is sort of increasingly challenged by as we move forward. So that's the sort of core thesis.
So how do you, one of the questions that I've seen raised is like, you often see a tension in open source product companies that are building a product on top of open source between making it too easy to use the open source community version. One of the things that as a community person, I've always focused on is, what's your 15-minute experience? How far can you get between, from website to plus website visit plus 15 minutes? What can you get done? And it's with a lot of these cloud projects, things like Kubernetes and Open Stack in recent years, things like the installer experience and the configuration experience has been something that's been a proprietary value add compared to the community projects, right? Over the Tri-Stack, or was it Tri-Stack? I can't remember. So how do you, like, when you're talking to open source product companies, how much do you tell them that they should focus on convenience in the adoption of the community open source version versus, differentiation in the product version?
Well, that's an interesting question because, to some degree it presupposes that the open source companies are not themselves running managed services, which is increasingly rare, these days. For the most part, most of the open source companies commercial open source companies we talk to, are sort of furiously spinning up software as a service, managed implementations, largely because they have to. But for the folks that aren't doing that, or do have the sort of tension that you sort of maintain, part of that is sort of inherent to the model, and frankly, it's one of the reasons that I recommend to all of our clients effectively that they should go the managed route. Because in other words, the advantage of the managed service route, from a commercial open source organization standpoint, is that you can put out exactly the same product and you are cleanly and clearly differentiated, right? Which is, hey, here's the product. If you want to go run it yourself, knock yourself out, right? Have fun. But if you want sort of this project as run and instantiated and maintained by professionals, then, we're the people to come talk to you about that. So there isn't any sort of clean, there's, and this, and I'm sure probably many of the people sort of watching this know this, when you are competing with sort of community and enterprise editions, there's always going to be that tension. There isn't sort of any clean way to look at it. But to your point, you do have to think about sort of, okay, if we make this really inconvenient to use, and really inconvenient to sort of pick up and run with, what are the implications for that long term, right? Because typically it's not good, right? You're going to have probably in most cases, sort of problems with adoption, problems with usage, and problems with, essentially getting to the ubiquity that you want, and in fact need, for a lot of open source commercial models.
Right. I'm reminded of, I think it was Tim O'Reilly who said that the number one enemy of most new authors is not copyright infringement, it's obscurity. There's a similar problem at play here. It's if people aren't using your stuff, there's actually not going to be even demand to run it as a hosted service by cloud providers, so you don't have to worry about that problem.
That's right. It's like in that regard, it's like the old DRM, the pre-iTunes DRM music, right? So they protected the music so heavily that no one could listen to it. So what's the point?
and now it's a huge part of the revenue model of the music industry.
That's right.
So there's one of those difficulties is that, it's difficult for a smaller product vendor to compete if, if an Amazon or Google or Microsoft decides to offer your product as a hosted service. How do you advise open source vendors to compete with, the Amazon version of the hosted service or the Google version of the hosted service?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things. So first of all, typically, for Amazon or for Google or for Microsoft or whomever, right, to offer the project, that means they're seeing a ton of demand, right? Because they don't just pick up sort of tiny new projects that don't have any users. There's nothing in it for them. So at the time when you begin competing with them, that means that you are a sort of widespread project. You have achieved a critical mass, right? So you are by definition sort of not really, I mean, you're the little guy relative to Amazon, or whomever, of course, but you're not a little guy anymore. By definition, you're a sort of big entity in and of yourself. So there's a couple of different ways to look at this, right? Sort of one way is that, and this is sort of one of the things that we've seen a bunch of the commercial suppliers, typically on the database side, have sort of said, all right, we're going to release licenses, which essentially behave in most respects like open source licenses, but it's explicitly and expressly forbid players like the cloud players from using them, right? So that's one way to do it. You can basically say, all right, I'm going to essentially try to realize some of the benefits of open source, meaning that the source itself is available. People can sort of look at it, potentially contribute fixes and so on, although that becomes sort of fraught. But I don't want to compete with Amazon, right? I don't want Amazon or whomever to pick up my stuff and run with it. So
this is kind of a Commons Clause or
Commons Clause
the newer licenses.
Yep. Commons Clause. I mean, you've seen a whole bunch of people have done this. Confluent, Mongo, Timescale DB, sort of list goes on and on and on, right? And even sort of prior to them, Cockroach took this approach. MariaDB took this approach. So there's a whole bunch of people sort of have gone down this route. Sort of intriguingly, most of them are database providers, but that's a much longer conversation. We probably don't have time for here. Anyhow, the point is that this is essentially all right, I sort of want a firewall between sort of this project and any potential competition from Amazon or whomever. So that is an approach. It's an approach that look, if people do it right, as long as they don't blur the lines between the commercial license and the open source license, then fine, right? So be it. If people are sort of willing to be transparent and just say, hey, this is not open source, but it has some of the same attributes, that's not a major concern, at least as far as I'm concerned. There are the Commons Clause that you mentioned in particular. My issue with that was that, in my opinion, that sort of intentionally and deliberately blurred the lines, right? So in other words, it was essentially a rider on an open source license that rendered the open source license not open source effectively, right? So it was BSD plus Commons Clause or whatever it might be, Apache plus Commons Clause, and as soon as you attach that, the open source license mentioned up front is no longer relevant, right? Because the terms are not open source. So that was that to me crossed a bright line in terms of, hey, we should have a clear delineation between what is and is not open source. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, the sort of bigger question to me is, of the people who are not in that camp, right? Of the people who have not taken that approach, which is most vendors who are not in the database space, sort of why is that? And sort of what is the sort of thinking? And the question to me is, like, if you are one of these providers thinking about taking that essentially exclusionary approach, sort of question number one is, does it work, right? And the answer is probably not, in the sense that, you take Mongo as an example. Mongo sort of transitioned from the AGPL, which is a very restrictive license, from a cloud provider standpoint, introduced a new license, the SSPL. And that license is not regarded as open source, not sanctioned by the OSI. So they did this, and what was it, 3 months, I believe, afterwards, Amazon came out with its document DB service, which cloned the MongoDB API. And a whole bunch of people said, well, hey, this is proof that this license protected Mongo, when in fact that project development on the Amazon side had been underway for well over a year, right? So the license had nothing to do with Amazon's sort of decision there, and more importantly, they're able to introduce a compatible service regardless of the source code, right? So essentially, what Amazon is saying there is that the API is essentially what's valuable, not necessarily the source code implementation behind it. So that's point one. Point two is that there are sort of recognizable and provable benefits for folks that do have sort of instantiations spun up by the cloud provider, right? On the one hand, look, nobody in their right mind wants to compete with somebody like an Amazon or Google and so on, because they're large, they're well capitalized, and so on. But the flip side of that is that there are a ton of databases on the market, right, in any category that you pick. And one of the hyperscale providers coming along and saying, hey, I'm going to support this one, as we discussed previously, means that there are a lot of users of that, right? So in other words, let's say I'm in the market for a document database, and I have a bunch of different options. And now I can pick between these ones that are smaller, don't see much usage, and one that is backed by both Mongo and Amazon and Microsoft, with their Cosmos DB product, right? That becomes a pretty easy decision. In terms of, oh, hey, this is the one that has the, clearly the most traction. This is the one that the market is agreeing on. So, to some degree, the sort of the spinning up of a competitive product from one of these cloud providers is nothing more than market validation. And then the question becomes, if you are sort of the database provider, are you better at developing your database than one of the cloud providers? And the answer, probably in most cases, is yes. So anyhow, there are debates. I go back and forth with this, with vendors all the time. We have let's call them robust and spirited dialogues, in which they will sort of explain all the ways I'm wrong, and how this is the only path for them, and so on. Personally, I just don't see it. I think that there are absolute ways to compete, using just your standard license, moving forward.
And this echoes something that Adam Jacob said last week, which is that the goal of having an open source project as part of your supply chain is that you have this very wide top of funnel. So the more offerings there are, the wider your top of funnel, the more opportunities you have down the funnel. Because essentially what you're doing is you're preventing other projects from getting traction in that market segment.
That's right. So, look, I think the way to look at it, if you were one of these companies, is that every user of the cloud service is a potential user of your project, right? And that is, sort of a huge thing, because essentially they're creating a much wider and larger market for your services. Right. So, it's hard, because on the one hand, look, if I understand it, I understand the visceral impulse, right? Which is, hey, I wrote this thing, I don't want somebody else to sort of go off and just sort of pick it up and sort of make money from it. But frankly, that's the kind of thinking that held Microsoft back for years, right? Which was Microsoft was fixated on sort of an idea that the only sort of route for this and the only sort of model is, I wrote this and therefore I'm the only one who should be paid for this. And that didn't do them any favors at the time. To their credit, they have sort of come around, and they've got open source religion. But this is just sort of the latest, sort of latest iteration of that, if you will. So yeah, I mean, Adam's a smart guy. Adam's got it right, which is, that, every single one of the users of these products on a cloud service, is, potentially a, user of your open source, your own sort of, commercial product, right? I mean, it's no different, to some degree than, I went back to Microsoft, and I had to go back and look at the timing, but it was, probably in the early, probably 04, 05, 06, somewhere in that range. And I had told Microsoft privately that the best thing that they could do at the time was to give the Mono project, which was an open source implementation, run by Miguel de Casa and Nat Friedman and those folks. Basically give them a patent amnesty. You don't have to support them. Just say that you're not going to sue this project. And all at once, Microsoft would have had a sort of at least competitive implementation on non-Microsoft platforms. And that was what they were getting killed for at the time, which was, hey, this works fine on Windows, but I have some workloads that I want to run on Linux. And, I can run Java on both platforms. I can run your stuff only on your platform. That doesn't do me any good. But Microsoft at the time was fixated on, no, we're not going to do that. And, we would never do that because, we wrote this and so on. And, to me, it was just short-sighted, because basically what Microsoft could have easily done would say, all right, you go off and sort of build this competitive implementation. Now we have a story that we can tell to, to potential customers. Yes, you can run on Linux, but you can also walk in and say, yeah, you can go run over there, but we wrote it. Like, we wrote the original. So if you want the best implementation, come to us. But either, we'd rather have you using our stuff than, some competing platform. And, like I said, the ideology of the company at the time didn't allow them to see that. And, I think that there are a lot of parallels, to the world that we see today.
I remember some of those conversations back in the Zimeon days, and after Zimeon was acquired by Novell, a lot of those .NET programs that were written by Zimeon and Novell were proposed for inclusion in GNOME, which would have gotten them into pretty much every distribution. It would have gotten them into Ubuntu and Red Hat distributions, and there were massive contentious discussions at the time around, is this safe for us to include this? Because there was this specter of patent infringement, potentially copyright, and it really cost, I think, .NET an adoption at a critical period where it could have become one of the first class runtimes on the Linux platform. Missed it.
For sure. I mean, C# learned a lot of lessons from Java, had the opportunity to take that broadly to market, and instead, the sort of strategic approach at the time was, largely guided, by that, basically leadership conviction, at Microsoft, which was, we wrote this, so we own it, and we should be the only people to profit from it. And it was just, you compare and contrast that versus, for example, what IBM did, with the Eclipse assets, right? IBM goes out and purchases, the core assets, that made up the Eclipse project for, I don't remember the exact amount, I think $200 million, and sort of looks at this and says, hey, this is just an asset. We can use this in different ways. And instead, what do? They go out and essentially say, all right, we're going to release this as open source, and we're going to create a wider, broader ecosystem, right? So if we're going to sort of try to sort of keep this close to the vest and own it, our share of the market's going to be small. If we are willing to give up some control, we can build a much wider sort of pie for all of us. And in so doing, to essentially steal some from Microsoft, who at the time was sort of one of their core competitors. So anyway, I think that the most important thing in all of this for me is that there's no one way to do things. There's no one strategy that works in every case. But the most important thing people can do is to try to let go of, I don't know, sort of emotional or visceral, sort of emotional attachments to code, or visceral sort of impressions of, what should and shouldn't be done, right? And just think of code, it's just an asset. There are different ways to use every asset, and those who are creative, can, potentially see some higher returns.
I think you could compare and contrast to Golang as well from Google in terms of the approach of getting a new language runtime to have traction in the market. I think they've done a great job with that.
Yeah, I mean, Golang is, it's plateaued to some degree in our rankings, but I mean, it is really, really difficult to break into the top 20, and they did that, within, I don't know what it was. I'd have to go back and look, within probably 2 years, which is that's hard to do.
So one of the things that has come up every time we've had these conversations is, not every company has the capacity or the skill set to do a hosted service. It's a big ask, right? It's something which is, it puts strain on smaller companies. There's a lot of projects. Memcache came to mind for me, but there are a lot of projects that are managed by, small volunteer developers or smaller companies that maybe wouldn't have the resources to make the investment in a managed cloud service. For projects like that, do you have any particular advice that you'd offer?
Yeah, it's hard, because again, we've been advising companies, to open source companies, that is, to basically go the managed service route for the better part of a decade, at least, probably 7-8 years. Pretty much every single one of the managed database offerings at some point, was badgered by us, many years before, they released their offerings to say, look, this is coming. Why aren't you doing this? You need to get online. And the answer was consistently the same as essentially what you're talking about, which is it's really difficult, right? It's a completely different business to spin up, to run, to manage, and to operate. Because it's one thing to say, all right, I wrote a piece of software. I'm going to take that to market. I'm going to sort of have sales and support staff to keep it running at client sites, but the client is responsible for the operation. Now, taking on that responsibility, that's not a light thing, right? So I totally get it. I get the trepidation. My answer typically in these situations, however, is you don't have a choice. Really, customers are going to get what they want one way or another. And if you don't give it to them, they're going to find it somewhere else. So, for the smaller organizations that are sort of faced with this choice, there are a couple different routes that you can take. One, you can always go get money to do this, right? Because the managed service business is a viable, known business that people sort of understand at this point. So you can certainly get funding, to go build out a managed service if you have traction in your project, which is the sort of, again, that sort of core premise, the core presupposition here, right? Which is that you have enough traction for this to matter. If that's not an option, you can go to, essentially any of the non-Amazon cloud providers, right? Because if you are Google, if you are, Microsoft, core job for you, number one, is to drive traffic. You want workloads, right? That is your absolute sort of priority, bar none. So you saw this, was it last year, I believe, at their next event, GCP had announced commercial partnerships with, I believe it was 8 different sort of commercial open source providers, and in some cases, part of those deals was trying to help these providers essentially get up to speed, because they were not sort of used to running sort of managed services and so on. So there will be providers that can help. There will be providers that can sort of pave the way, if you will. Or then lastly, just sort of build, bootstrap and build it yourself. There are ways to do this. If you start slow, if you start cautiously, because look, it'd be a huge lift. It'd be, frankly, an impossible lift for most of these companies if they had to build out the infrastructure themselves. But as we all know, right, you can go out and rent infrastructure pretty quickly and pretty easily, for many of the large cloud providers. So that part of it, at least, is sort of taken care of for you. Doesn't mean it's, the rest of it's easy. It's not, by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly can be done. You can bootstrap yourself. So you have options is the short answer.
So if you're coming in as a smaller vendor looking to get bulk prices, like how hard is that to do with a cloud vendor? Is it do you come in and basically pay list until you kind of prove out that you have need for a demand? And
it can vary. Again, a lot of it will depend on the traction for the project, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, typically that's less of an issue, simply because by the time this matters, you can go to them and say, look, I am X project, and by X project, it will be widely understood to say, look, this is nearly ubiquitous. Everybody wants this, right? So the demand from a workload standpoint should be pretty evident. So, in theory, you're not a sort of standard small business showing up, right, and asking for help. You are in a different category altogether because you come sort of baked in with, usage behind you. Now, will you negotiate better terms, once you've demonstrated that? For sure. But in other words, you shouldn't expect to come in off the street and just pay list if you're a popular project.
Okay. Have you seen any small companies successfully kind of partner with cloud providers to have like the cloud provider provide the managed service part, and you basically manage the product roadmap and work with them on fixing any issues with the product itself?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, a couple of the deals, that GCP signed, were kind of that ilk, in the sense that, Google would take on, some of the SRE work, right? And Google would take on, what is it? I think it was either first and second level calls, and then, basically escalate to the provider for the third. So it definitely can happen. It definitely can work. But for the most part, most of the companies that we talk to are trying to sort of build their own. Because they want sort of more control of their own destiny, right? And I can't name names, but there put it this way, we have seen small providers. There's a team that I met with probably 2.5 years ago. When I met with them initially, it was I don't know, probably 10 people, 10 or 12 people, sort of in a room. And I won't even say the city because I think they give away. Anyway, I had met with them and they had said, look, we don't have the time. We don't have the sort of ability at this point to spin up a service business.
Okay.
And I, at the time I expressed my, hey, look, you need to do this one way or another. Anyhow, within a 12-month period, I spoke to them again and their tune had changed entirely. They were full on, spinning this up, and now, that's the fastest area growing their business, by quite a margin. So it can be done. It can be done by small teams, and like I said, the returns are going to be there because basically, managed services are how people want to consume things at this point, because they're more convenient.
So we have another question. Let me see. Is open core still a viable business model for open source companies? Base functionality open source, advanced functionality is closed, or is that kind of, did that have its time in the last decade or the decade before?
Look, I think it still is. There will be companies that use that model probably forever, right? Simply because, particularly if you're selling, sort of a substantial amount of your, business on-prem, then, that's one way to do it, right? So I'm thinking of companies like a Yugabyte, for example, right? So basically the core database functionality is all there. You get the database for free, it's all open source and so on. Their sort of open core, if you will, their proprietary layer is a layer that comes in and basically automatically sets everything up and configures it in a sort of in a cloud, right? So models like that are going to be around for a long time. That's not going to go away, right? And people are going to find out and try to find ways to say, okay, what's the trigger here? How do I trigger you into buying something? And some proprietary extension is going to do that. That being said, basically, if you look across the industry, as we talked about a couple times, really the traction here, the trend is, for managed services, right? And managed services, have the advantage, as I've talked about with vendors many, many times, have the advantage of, you don't have the same conversations about sort of what is and isn't open source, when it's a managed service, right? You don't have, people sort of think of a service in a fundamentally different way than they do a sort of piece of software, that they might sort of download and install themselves. So, what you will see and are seeing are examples where, the managed service includes a couple features that are not available in sort of the core products, right? And that will undoubtedly continue. That is, that's arguably open core. It's not open core necessarily as we've known it because of the managed service component to it. But anyway, short answer is that, yeah, that model will be with us for a while. But by and large, if you're betting on sort of, models moving forward, core managed service is going to be the way to go.
Okay. I'm curious. It occurs to me that as a company running a managed service yourself, when it gets to the size where Amazon decides this is something that we should launch, they're going to be able to run it at a lower cost because they have, mainline access to the managed service backbone. They have, they operate at scale. It's what they know how to do well. So they'll be able to offer presumably a cheaper service than the company that's the origin, that's the company making the product.
Yep.
When that happens, or if that happens, how do you advise people to compete against the Amazon hosted service?
Well, because it cuts both ways, right? So in other words, think about it this way. The economies of scale are absolutely in the cloud provider's favor when it comes to their costs, right? In terms of they're going to be able to get people cheaper than you, infrastructure cheaper than you, network power cooling, take your pick, right? Because, look, they're the hyperscale provider and you're not. So their cost base is always going to be lower. But conversely, if you think about sort of the scale of their portfolio, right? What is the likelihood, how much time and attention can they devote to any one product, any one project, any one service, right? And the answer is not a lot, right? Versus your implementation is the only thing that you do, right? That's it, presumably, or it's one of just a sort of much smaller number. So what that means is that take sort of any of the databases that have been cloned, sort of by Amazon, by other providers, they are one of a sea of offerings, right? And how competitive are they going to be? Forget the engineering, right? Because often the teams who originated the software have much larger engineering teams, and in theory should be able to innovate faster. But set that aside, right? They're also able to deliver 100% focus on their product, their vision, their differentiation, new features, innovation, all of that, right? And the team that essentially has replicated that product or service, I mean, they are one, constrained by what you're doing, because they have to sort of maintain that compatibility, sort of moving forward, because they've implicitly and at times explicitly promised that to their customers. So, sort of number one, they're constrained. Number two, they have to play catch up, right? They continually they can't get out in front of you, because otherwise, they're going to break, that compatibility layer that they promised, right? So, for sure, the cost differential is going to be there. But sort of the nature of these services and how they're offered really should lend itself to you being able to charge a premium for your product, more or less indefinitely. Now, I say that there are going to be people who say, I don't really care, I just need the bare minimum and so on, which is fine. But in other words, they were not likely to be a great customer of yours anyway, right? So in other words, the customers, the premium customers, the customers who actually care about the innovation that you're delivering, should be easily capturable.
Okay. So there's another question that occurred to me is, whether on-prem, are there any market segments or use cases or places, specific circumstances like maybe, I don't know, IoT, edge computing, where on-prem software will continue for medium to long term to be more relevant than managed services and cloud providers, or is everything now going to be moving to centralized managed clouds at some point?
No, I don't believe that. My answer, so I get asked by the press, with some frequency, like, hey, is private cloud a thing? And my answer to that question is always the same, which is, I ask them, hey, do you believe that, everything 100% is going to go to the cloud? And typically they say no, which is, in my opinion, the correct answer. And, if the answer is no, then, the next question is, would you want your private infrastructure to resemble a cloud? And the answer, of course, is yes, you would, right? So, the net is that, sort of when we think about, sort of on versus off-prem, there's going to be settings, you mentioned, sort of edge, right? I'm of the opinion that the differentiation there, the edge versus, sort of general purpose cloud differentiation will break down, right? We're seeing all kinds of compute pushed out to the edge and so on. But the net is that, look, you're going to have, I don't know, circumstances like oil rigs in the North Atlantic Sea, right? You're always going to have these sort of cases where it's, look, I need something on site for, whatever the reasons might be. But just as important, you're going to have use cases internally at organizations where, they are going to be running, their own, sort of infrastructure indefinitely in many cases, right? So, yeah, do we see, I talked to a financial regulatory agency and a financial services company, within the past, what was it, year? I think it was a year. And both of them basically deprecated their entire database staff, right? Everybody has been basically retasked because they've gone all in on managed service databases. And yet, you go out and talk to other organizations, and guess what? They're still doing a lot of on-prem. They still have data centers. They're maintaining them for, whatever the reason, right? It could be, compliance. It could be security. It could be, some combination of all of the above. Now, the growth is going to come from managed services for sure, but are we going to have on-prem, sort of, both general purpose and edge instances more or less indefinitely? I mean, the answer to me seems pretty clear, right? Because it's, you see every so often analysts will basically sit down and say, all right, this is what's going to, just look at the math, right? We were just talking about the economies of scale that, essentially enterprises, or rather the hyperscale cloud providers, can bring to bear. So why would anybody invest in their own infrastructure if somebody else can sort of buy hardware, software, networking, power, everything cheaper than you can, right? On paper, the case is pretty clear. But that assumes that everyone is a rational actor. That further assumes that there are no justifications, no legitimate justifications for keeping things on site. And it further assumes that, basically these decisions are made on paper. And the fact is they're not, right? A lot of these decisions are made based on inertia, based on, what has happened and so on. So anyway, I could go on and on and on, but the short version is that, on-prem infrastructure, on-prem, certainly edge, is going to be with us for a long time, in which case there will be settings in which, look, that'll be the priority, for certain offerings for sure.
So is the default model then going forward something like a hybrid cloud where part of your application infrastructure is running locally and you're using some managed services, or you've got some compute running locally and kind of bursting out, or some compute running in a public cloud?
Well, that depends to me on sort of what your definition of hybrid cloud is, right? So in other words, the difficulty for me with hybrid cloud as a term has always been that there are those who would suggest or believe that term implies some super advanced architecture, right, where you seamlessly are blending on and off-prem assets and they work in perfect, in perfect relation to one another. And that, in my experience, is exceedingly rare, right? So in other words, it's really rare that people have, essentially design their architecture such that they can transcend on and off-prem infrastructures, and more importantly, the architectural differences that are implied there with impunity, right? That just doesn't happen all that often. That being said, if by hybrid cloud you mean I'm going to be using a bunch of stuff from different places, that to me essentially is a reality. So I joked about this on a presentation last week. That I was at I won't say who it was. I was at a cloud vendor, a proprietary vendor event back in 2010. So this is 4 years after the initial introduction of first S3 and then EC2 from Amazon, thereby creating the cloud market. So I'm at this event, a couple hundred people in the audience, and I do a straw poll. And I say, okay, who here is using sort of anything from cloud? Anything. Not running any production workloads, just anything. Like, test, staging, dev, whatever. Not a single hand went up, right? And I'm sitting there while I'm giving the presentation. I'm sitting there doing the math in the back of my head. I'm like, there's a couple hundred people here. That's basically impossible. Somebody somewhere is using something. And sure enough, I finish my presentation. I walk off the stage, and there's a sort of small crowd of people there, and every single one of them came up with essentially the same story, which was, I'm actually using a bunch of it, but my sales guy was at the table, and I don't want him to know. So what can you tell me about this? What can you tell me about that? Right. So it just goes back to, essentially what we said about organizations all along. I wrote this in the New Kingmakers, which is that the CIO is the last to know, and that the Venn diagram, and again, this is in the book, is, basically if you have a Venn diagram of like what the, sort of a company thinks is being used, what developers want to use, and what is actually being used, the overlap is what developers want to use. So when I talk to companies today and they say, I'm all on-prem, or conversely, I'm all in on this one cloud supplier and that's the only thing I use, let's just say that I'm skeptical, because sort of long experience has taught me that somewhere somebody is using something that no one else knows about, from some other provider. So in other words, if your definition, back to the original question, is, hey, are you using a bunch of stuff from a bunch of different people? That's going to be the reality, I think, for most companies for a long time.
So we're not that far removed from the engineer running the intranet and the mailbox and the print server off a Linux machine that's basically recommissioned in the corner.
That's right. Yeah. So in other words, it's like, oh, hey, I can remember the days when people used to do, well, at least what we used to call in the sort of old days, midnight requisitioning, right? And people put together these like Franken clusters of PCs from folks that sort of, left the company. They would sneak in the middle of the night, grab it, pop it into a cluster and, sort of use that for all kinds of things. So, basically what you end up finding is that, what's the Jurassic Park saying? Like life will find a way, like open source will find a way, and clouds will find a way. So you can try to, sort of regulate and restrict, however you want, but, more often than not, you're going to find, yourself using things that you weren't aware of. I can recall, I was at a lunch, many years ago with a newspaper that everybody would know. Newspaper was having some tough times, had to mortgage its building, had a spending freeze. And, I was at lunch with these guys and they had said, yeah, we found a way. And I was like, okay, well, what's the way? Like, how did you make this work? And they said, well, there's a technology freeze, so we're not allowed to buy anything, but we're not being asked to do less stuff. So we needed to find, some way to sort of add capacity. And they looked around at the newsroom and saw that all of the expenses for books, for their reporters were being approved. So they sat back and had a couple seconds to think about this, and they said, what if we started buying our infrastructure and it said Amazon? Would the expense people think it was just books? And it turned out that worked like a champ. So this organization, as far as they knew, were running their own data centers and, sort of not running anything in the cloud. And in fact, they were purchasing way more books than they realized because, it was their technical infrastructure they ran on.
That's hilarious.
Yep.
So one last question before we sign off. For somebody thinking of running a managed data service, how important is it for customers these days, criteria like where the data lives, data sovereignty? And if you're running a managed data service on top of a cloud, how easy is it as a consumer of that cloud to ensure that you're kind of providing a data localization SLA to your customers?
I think that the sovereignty question is important, across a number of dimensions, right? There's the obvious, sort of ones in terms of compliance, particularly with, sort of most notably some of the European regulations, right? So, where the data sits is important, but where the data sits is important often, for performance reasons as well, right? I want to know where my data is. I want to know, sort of how far it is, because it's one of these, I had this conversation with somebody last week or 2 weeks ago. Look, there's a reason CDNs exist. And the reason is that you want to put the content, you want to put the data as close to the user as you can. And obviously you can't do that for all data. It's not possible, sort of at this point in time. But, look, there are reasons that, essentially where the data is located matters. So, the advantage that you have in many cases as a managed service provider is that the hard work has already been done for you, right? In the sense that, you can, go to many of these cloud software suppliers and basically spin things up in geos all over the world, right? In a lot of cases, it depends on the vendor, of course, but in a lot of cases, from a managed service standpoint, you have pretty good controls in terms of where things are going, right? And a lot of times you yourself are specifying that by picking regions, by picking hey, this is where I want this to go, and sort of these restrictions I want to place on it. So obviously support for that varies across vendors, and some are better at it than others. But suffice to say, it's an important question, and one that a lot of the folks have spent a lot of time and energy thinking about.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give one last shout out for questions and contributions here from the audience. Anybody else have something that they want to bring up with Stephen today?
Please not licensing.
Except for licensing.
No, any questions?
Yeah, we had that conversation before. I think it's it's one of those topics that's always fun to get into with open source people, but it's also one of the least important topics in terms of the actual big picture, I think is anyway, from my perspective.
Fair to say. I don't know that I characterize it as fun, but it is. It's an important topic from time to time. I mean, the big thing for me there always is just I don't care. People respecting the boundaries of open source and respecting the definition. Knock yourself out, do whatever you want to do. The thing that gets me riled up and certainly gets other communities riled up are when people are not respecting that definition, not respecting the work that has come before them, because a lot of people have spent a lot of time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears over the years in terms of sort of getting us to where we are today, which certainly is an imperfect system, but is light years better than what we had a couple decades ago. And you just don't want to see people trample that. So
I want to give a shout out to
to
my colleague, Richard Fontana, who actually wrote an excellent piece this week on opensource.com, a thought piece on whether the open source definition is in need of revision. So shout out to that article, and let's carry on that conversation on Twitter, I think is the right advice.
For sure.
So thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us today.
Not at all, my pleasure.
Next week, we will have Dirk Riele, an open source researcher from Europe, talking about open source labor economics. So I'm very interested to see what we come up with in that conversation. Thanks again for joining us, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye.